as I know you know.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you so much, Zainab, for that beautiful introduction. Really moves me to hear how that had affected you at that time. And I hope I'll be able to share some of these ideas with everyone here in a way that really comes alive for everyone. And just to give you a heads up of how this hour is going to go, I'm going to, start off the first part of it, first 30, maybe 35 minutes or so, just taking you through a little bit about some of the ideas that are actually in that book, The Patterning Instinct that Zineb talked about, and kind of broader about understanding worldviews. And then we're going to go into a bit of a workshop. I'll take you through some interactive work. We've got a PDF that either you have access to or we'll share, but I'll also have it on screen. And then I want to try to make sure we allow time at the end for a general kind of Q&A and a general discussion about that workshop. Um, if possible, we might just try to go into breakout rooms after doing the workshop to talk about it. I'm not sure if we're going to have time, so we'll just play that by ear and we'll just kind of go from there. So right now, let me share my screen and see how this is going to work. Let's see. Um, is this looking good right now? Everyone can see? Okay, super. So as you can see, this is what we're going to be talking about, cultural mindfulness, and I'll explain what that means as we go later into the presentation. But particularly, one thing we know it means is gaining perspectives on worldviews. So I'm actually going to start with a really nice way to begin. I think we're all going to kind of enjoy. Um, Beautiful little picture of this lovely, beautiful little infant. Um, and the reason I want to start with her is because we all know that as she begins to grow up, she'll go from sort of going cuckoo and stuff like that to learning language of whatever culture she happens to have been born into. And before too long, she'll start trying out words and then she'll make sentences and, everyone will go, oh, how beautiful. Look at that. She said, um, but the point about this is no one is telling her at this point. Now, I want you to really listen hard and make sense of all the stuff that you're hearing and connect it with things. And we've got this thing called language you need to learn. No one's telling her that, right? And she is just naturally putting together, she's sort of connecting up all these patterns of the sounds she hears and the touches she feels and experiences she has. And before too long, it begins to come together to her. She makes patterns about it. That's because she and all of us human beings have a uniquely advanced part of our brain compared to pretty much any other mammal called the prefrontal cortex. It's the part that is kind of in the front of our brain. And in terms of evolutionary, like sort of just size, it's relation to the rest of our brain and everything else, it's more advanced, we know, than other mammals have. And this prefrontal cortex, or PFC, people call about it, um, it mediates those parts of our cognition that are uniquely human. Sort of things like symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, creating abstractions, controlling our physiological drives, and crucially, imposing meaning on things, right? And that's a crucial aspect of this prefrontal cortex. So much so that that book that Zineb talked about, that I wrote some years back, actually called The Patterning Instinct. Because as humans, just like that little infant, we have this instinct to put patterns of meaning into the universe around us. Um, and in this book, I looked and basically, I think somebody should try to mute if you can. Um, Basically, we can look at that way in which we put patterns of meaning into things as a sort of a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning. And I'll take you back, if we go back to the very earliest moments, earliest periods in human history, when we first evolved as human beings. Like imagine very, very, very early, and even before language or anything, humans, early hominids, like looked up at the sky and they saw these stars, right? Just like the stars we see now. but very early in the human experience, virtually every culture around the world looked at that and they started to put patterns into what they saw. They made constellations. They basically tried to make meaning out of the universe through their patterning instinct. And in every culture, what happens is when cultures look around at the world around them, like just nature, at very earliest times, they form what are known as root metaphors of nature. So they sort of look at it and they try to make sense of it in terms of their lived experience, to try to understand what this universe is like. And we'll come, it might be a little unclear what I mean by root metaphors. We'll come to that in a few moments. So don't worry if you don't quite get what I'm saying there. But from those root metaphors of the way they make sense of nature, they form what are known as entailments or like implications. If you make sense of nature in a certain way, there'll be implications to that in terms of how you live your life. And out of those come like sort of stories that you make about the universe and you make about life in general, or narratives. And those narratives have outcomes. And those outcomes culturally affect the shape of history. So one of the sort of distillations from that book, The Patterning Instinct, that Zineb talked about, goes just like this, that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And I'm going to show you right now, we're going to spend a few minutes looking historically at what I mean when I say those, that sort of root metaphors lead to those values, and those values shape what happens in the world and what has happened to date. So when we look back at history, there's only been really a couple of times in all of human history when those root metaphors of nature that I talked about actually shifted, fundamentally shifted. We spent basically 95+% of our human history as nomadic hunter-gatherers. Well, that started changing about 10,000 years ago, and we moved into agriculture. And then that stayed fairly stable until a few hundred years ago when the scientific revolution came. And most people who look at what's going on in the world today recognize that we're undergoing probably as massive a change as those this century. The question is, what's that going to move to? And so we're going to look at each of these shifts in these rudimentary metaphors of nature that took place from one shift to another, starting with those nomadic hunter-gatherers that we all have as our great ancestors, 95% of our history. Now, for nomadic hunter-gatherers around the world, the root metaphor that they used when they made sense of nature was really like seeing nature like a giving parent. And if you imagine all of nature as a giving parent, well, here are the entailments or implications that leads to. Well, then all living beings must be family if nature is a parent, right? Because parents of every other living beings. And that means we all have an intimate relationship with the spirits of those beings around us. If nature's a parent, then we can trust nature to meet our needs. And since we're all part of the same family, everything is connected. And because we see everyone as part of that family, the natural world has intrinsic value. We don't have to put value into it. It just is there, inherent in the world. Now, that way of meaning making began to shift quite powerfully with the rise of agriculture. And we'll take a look just very briefly at that. Well, one of the first things that happened with agriculture is like separation started to come into the human experience, basically. I always think this picture of a fence is iconic for what agriculture is about, because all of a sudden you grow your crops in the field, you separate those crops from the rest of nature. So there's this separation of humans and the human lived experience from the rest of nature. And then that fence also keeps out other people. So you're also separating, humans get separated from other humans. And those farmers that were lucky enough to grow more crops than others begin to gain wealth. And then they started to employ people and they started to keep other people out of their wealth. And hierarchies began to arise. And from those hierarchies, chieftains arose. And all of a sudden, there was this whole leveling and the whole unleveling of the human experience from being egalitarian to being very hierarchical. So the sense that people began to make sense of the universe now was very different. Rather than seeing nature as a giving parent, it was more like a hierarchy of the gods. And from that, a different set of entailments came from that root source, that root metaphor, a sense of the intrinsic value of things like wealth, possessions, and power that wasn't there before. There was a sense that you could no longer like trust the gods. And so you need to like worship them, just like you had to sort of pay obeisance to the chieftain or whatever. And you had to sacrifice to show them how much you cared about your devotion to them. And then a priesthood would mediate between you and those gods up there. And you had to respect the hierarchy, of course, at all times. And along with the hierarchy, the patriarchy, because this was also the beginning of the rise of the patriarchy. When women became the property of the male, they got objectified sexually, excluded from power, silenced in the public sphere. All that came with this rise of agriculture. And even though different civilizations around the world, looked very different, they had totally different languages and cultures, they all shared some of that four core foundational metaphor of nature, and those hierarchical entailments that went along with it. And then about 2,500 years or so ago, two unprecedented patterns of meaning arose in the world, different, basically core metaphors of nature, and making sense of them. One was in China. We won't go into too much detail in this one, we don't have time, but there they sort of took that hunter-gatherer notion of everything being connected, and they made it far more elaborate, looking at this interconnected cosmos of yin and yang, and the I Ching with this set of all these different ways in which yin and yang could connect up. And they saw the role of the sage, basically, as pondering what they called the Tao. The Tao was like the way in which all this complex web of stuff manifested in the universe. And so their core metaphor that they started to use for looking at the natural world was looking at nature as being like a harmonic web of life. And so the whole point, if everything you live in is like a web, well, we know when we walk through nature, just a little drop of rain or leaf touching a web will cause the whole thing to reverberate. So they saw that as the role of humans in that web was to be very attuned to all the reverberations of everything that you did affecting the universe. Now, meanwhile, in Greece, a very different pattern of meaning arose. And this one we can understand as being what people call dualism, which is a sense of a split cosmos and a split human along with it. So this is a picture of Plato and Aristotle. And Plato is the older guy, sort of pointing up at the heavens, because Plato saw some source of goodness and deity and divinity in the heavens as being fixed and perfect. And the world itself was more like this kind of polluted place. And along with that, the human was also split, where the brain or the reasoning capability of the soul connected us with that divinity, and the brain was imprisoned in this body that was also polluted, just like the rest of the earth. And the idea of what life is about was to connect with that divinity through your brain or your reason. And Christianity inherited that Platonic dualism. And they developed what was known as Christian rationalism. And right now, we always think of things like Christianity or religion as being like opposed to science. But actually, Christianity served as an incubator for science and for rational thought because of this sense of the divinity that God created out there in the universe. In fact, this is a medieval image of God as basically like the great clockmaker. He made this like sort of perfect world with his measuring calipers there. And the scientific, those like pioneers of the scientific revolution, people like Kepler or Galileo or whatever, they saw that because God's perfect, like Plato thought, that nature must have a perfect geometry. So everything had to fit in this sort of looking for perfection in nature. And this way of thinking led to this new way of making sense of the world, a new root metaphor of nature with the scientific revolution, which basically was that it saw nature as a machine. And if you think of nature as a machine, then you should be able to figure out exactly how it works. So you can actually make it do whatever you want it to do by using that machine. And this was the sort of exciting vision that they had during the scientific revolution. This is like quotes from Francis Bacon, who was like a prophet of the scientific age. He said how we can conquer nature, we can establish and extend the power of dominion of the human race itself over the universe and render ourselves the masters and possessors of nature. Well, this was an exciting period for those early scientists, and they were incredibly successful over hundreds of years. So much so that this root metaphor has led to the foundational worldview we have today, which looks something like this. It's a modern story, basically, of separation from that natural world, seeing nature as a machine, seeing humans separate from nature, seeing humans as separate from each other, and seeing human progress really coming from that conquest of nature. And the earth then is just a resource, basically, to exploit for human benefit. And with all that, ultimately, the purpose of life is basically just to get wealthy and powerful. Now, today, we are living all around us, experiencing the implications of what that worldview has done. And I don't need to tell you about things like the wildfires, the floods, the droughts we're all experiencing around the world as a result of the climate emergency. This climate emergency that, you're probably familiar with a graph like this that shows how we're headed at this rate towards catastrophic climate temperature increase by the end of this century. We have to dramatically change things, like really radically, if we're going to have any chance of getting it to even close to what might be a safe target. But even beyond climate, which we're also aware of, the climate emergency itself is more like a symptom of a deeper imbalance that has arisen from this worldview, which is basically that we're ransacking the natural world because we just see it as this resource or a machine to be used for our own purposes. And that's led to basically vast ecological destruction across the board. Just to give you just a few quick pointers, we've seen a 69% decline in animal populations worldwide just since 1970 alone, in just like the last 50 years. We're looking, because of this and other changes, at the sixth great extinction of species since life began on Earth billions of years ago. This is the first one, though, caused by one species' actions, our own. We're looking at the annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century. And the UN predicts that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by the middle of this century. But of all statistics, the one that blows me away the most is this one, that at current rates, by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And as a result of this ultimately this core metaphor of nature, scientists are calling out that we've broken through basically our planetary boundaries. There's a group led by somebody called Johan Rockström, who looks at that little green circle, looks at the safe operating space according to 9 different planetary boundaries that they've identified. The orange represents how much we've blown away through 5 of those 9. And that's why they say things like they're warning humanity. Soon it'll be too late to shift course away from our failing trajectory. Another head of the Potsdam Institute says there's a very big risk we'll end our civilization. The UN Secretary General is calling it collective suicide. So this is obviously a dramatic result that comes from this core metaphor we have right now. And if we go back to what I talked originally about, how culture shapes values and values shape history, when we're looking at this disaster that we may be headed for, we need to recognize that similarly, the values we hold today will shape the future. And those values ultimately arise from the worldview that we hold. So let's look at the possibilities of a different kind of worldview than that dominant worldview that we have inherited today, a worldview of deep interconnectedness. And that's one that I wrote about in this other book that got published a couple of years ago called The Web of Meaning. The subtitle is Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. And in that book, I look at how we can actually integrate science with traditional wisdom. Science is not about rejecting traditional wisdom at all, just the form of science that led to that dominant worldview. If we look at modern sciences like neuroscience, complexity science, evolutionary biology, or system sciences, what we find is they point to the same core underlying truths that traditional wisdom points to, like indigenous knowledge or Taoism or Buddhism, which is basically the reality of our deep interconnectedness. And systems thinkers around the world today actually points to a connected universe, whether it's from places like systems biology or chaos theory or complexity science. What they see is they look at humans and nature as basically complex systems, and they recognize that everything is connected, but in nonlinear ways. They're difficult to predict. And in fact, Edward Lorenz, who was the founder of chaos theory some decades ago, used to introduce the idea by putting this question: is it possible, he said, that the wings of a butterfly flapping in Brazil could somehow lead to a tornado in Texas? Not because you could predict that'll happen, but because of that nonlinear way in which all things interconnect in the world. So that relates a lot, that way of looking at the universe, a little bit like that Chinese worldview we talked about, this harmonic web of life where you touch one little thing and it has maybe unexpected reverberations throughout the world. And it helps us to then recognize that we live right now in this deeply interconnected world. So from that kind of context, I'm going to now lead us through, I'm going to sort of lead us into this notion of a workshop we can do to explore this for ourselves. The sense of what I call cultural mindfulness, to recognize and shape our own patterns of meaning. And to begin with, I'm going to just kind of go back to that model I showed you earlier. Remember how root metaphors lead to entailments, which lead to narratives or stories, which ultimately have outcomes. And let's begin again by remembering this notion of the patterning instinct, the fact that just like early humans we saw looked at those stars and they formed those constellations. And an important thing to notice when you make a pattern in something is that as soon as you have a constellation, you focus on the stars that are in that constellation, and you begin to ignore, almost like make invisible, the stars that are outside of that constellation. So patterns do two very important things. They connect things together in a meaningful way, and they focus your attention on what you connect together, and they kind of begin to avoid the things that you don't put in that pattern. And here's a way you can get that quite simply. Like, look at this pattern, right? Just a pattern of little dots. So as you look at it, you kind of make a sort of pattern in your own mind, right? From what you see. And now look at this one. Now, you're probably looking at this one I just put up and in color, and you notice that the pattern is all different from the one on the left. It's exactly the same set of dots, just one is seen through one lens, just a black and white lens, and one is seen through a colored lens. And yet what we see is two different sets of patterns. And I'm going to just take you really briefly through a fascinating experiment that actually got conducted about 100 years ago by some social scientists. And what they did was they took a group of people in like a workshop sort of environment. And at the beginning of the day, they gave them these ambiguous symbols, right? You can't quite make sense out of what these symbols are. But one group, they divided them into two groups. One group, they gave labels around those symbols. So for example, the second one down, they said it was a bottle. Or the second one from the bottom, they said was a gun, right? So each one, as soon as you say, oh, okay, that's the label, now I'm making sense of it, then that something forms in their mind. Now the other group, they gave different names to those same symbols. So that second one down, they called a stirrup, right? And the second one from the bottom, they called a broom, for example. So, and then they gave them all kinds of other exercises to do. They set them off doing other stuff through the day. And later on, they asked each group to draw the symbols they had been shown originally. Now, the group on that one side that got told that that one ambiguous symbol was a bottle, well, they basically drew a bottle like you see over here. Or the group that got told it was a gun, Well, they got it. They just they drew a gun. Now, the groups on the other side, however, who had been told that that ambiguous symbol was a stirrup, they drew a stirrup. And the ones who were told it was a broom drew a broom. So the sense they made of that ambiguity led to the way they remembered it and what they and how they made sense out of what it was. That was their reality that they caused. So you can imagine, like we've been looking at metaphors of nature. Like just take a like a picture of imagine you're somebody walking in this natural space right now. And imagine it one you're an indigenous person, somebody maybe who has stayed connected with some of those indigenous worldviews I looked at earlier. Well, you might look at that and you might see this landscape filled with living spirits all around you. But now imagine you're walking through that same landscape and you're a developer, a real estate developer with tons of money to invest. Well, you might look at that and you say, oh, what a perfect place for this beautiful like eco resort that I can make tons of money from. It's going to be so great for everyone. Or you might be walking through that and be an employee of a big ag firm that makes tons of money by turning this into monocrop agriculture. And you might go, what a great landscape for palm oil plantation or whatever. So the way in which you see that landscape will be very different depending on the lens you bring into it. So this, now I've kind of introduced this, this is why we're now ready to go into what I call cultural mindfulness exercise. Now, the reason I call it cultural mindfulness, I'm sure some of you have probably experimented or tried or maybe do as a practice mindfulness meditation. And in mindfulness meditation, one of the things you're told to do is as you get to be sort of mindful of all the different thoughts and stories and stuff going in your own consciousness, you begin to realize that you make stories up about the world around you. And, so you might be thinking about some conversation you had with a friend yesterday, and you go, oh, she thinks this or that. And then you begin through this mindfulness exercises to realize, actually, this is a story I'm making up. I don't know for sure that that's exactly what happened. And that liberates you to be open up to other possibilities of making sense of the world once you realize that you are making up stories for yourself about the world. So the same is true of our cultural stories. Once we begin to realize the stories that we're making up around the world or our culture makes up around the world, it frees us to be open to other possibilities. So that's why I call it like cultural mindfulness. And what we're going to do with this workshop, sort of part of the exercise, is we're going to take a theme, and I'll give you choices in a minute, so don't worry about doing anything right now. But for this example, I'll take you through an example. Let's take nature as a theme. It's one we've been kind of exploring through this presentation. And hopefully you'll have access through a PDF to a piece of paper that looks like something like this. But if not, I'll take you through it on the screen. So don't worry if you don't. And what we're going to do is first we're going to look at, for the particular theme that we choose, let's understand how the dominant culture thinks about it. So we're going to look, hold on, let me go there. We're going to look at the metaphors and the stories and the outcomes of that dominant culture. And then we're going to look at what an alternative metaphor might be and how that might lead to different stories and different outcomes. And so I'll take you through this example with nature right now so you can see what I'm doing and then you can try it for yourself. So if I take nature as a theme, first I'll look at the stories. What are the stories that I hear when just in the media or just any kind of TV show, whatever I write about nature? Basically, it's a human should conquer nature, that nature has no intrinsic value, that it should be exploited for maximum benefit, that maybe it presents an engineering challenge like climate change. How do we fix that? And there's a sense that we can value and own and buy and sell natural resources, right? These are just some of the common stories about nature. And then we realize that all comes from this core metaphor underlying all this, that nature just is a machine. And then we can look at some of the outcomes of that. Well, some of those are positive outcomes, like incredible technology we have today or scientific knowledge. And some of those are negative outcomes, like climate breakdown, environmental degradation, and our unsustainable future. So then from that, we can come up with what about if we had an alternative or root metaphor for nature, such as like nature is a harmonic web. And what would be the stories that we would make of the universe if we had that core metaphor? Well, it would probably be things like everything is connected, or humans then are part of nature, or the earth or Gaia is a holistic living organism. That might lead to different outcomes, such as a healthy, sustainable ecosystem or living within our planetary boundaries, right? So this is the kind of exercise we're going to do, just as a way to explore. It's not like we're going to come up with all the answers in just a few minutes, but just to explore these opportunities, kind of like developing a muscle for this kind of cultural mindfulness. So to begin with, what I'm going to ask you to do is to choose a theme. It's like I just took you through a theme of nature. And these are examples of what you can choose. You can also choose a theme of anything that is actually important to you. Something that maybe you're working on a project or you're engaging in some work that is around a particular theme and that's arise for you. But if you're not sure what theme to use, any of these can work. These are ambiguous themes. Every one of these, gender, happiness, education, prosperity, freedom, progress, security, spiritual meaning, health, any one of these are very ambiguous concepts, just like those symbols I showed you earlier, that people can make sense of in different ways. So let's pause for a moment and I'll just give you a minute or so you can choose a theme. If you have that sort of a printout of that PDF in front of you, you can use that. Otherwise, just take any piece of paper that you have, or even a notepad on your computer, and you can just write down on that. You don't need to have it in that particular framework that I just showed you there. So I'll assume that you've chosen a theme now, and I'm going to take you through step by step how we'll be doing this. So you don't need to be remembering anything. And so first off, write down your theme. If you have the printout, write it in the middle, or just if you just got any piece of paper, write it on the top. And now let's spend a couple of minutes thinking about, for your particular theme, what are these stories that are dominant in our world today about that theme? What are the sort of the major things that people just say without really thinking about when they're talking about that particular theme? So I'll give you a couple of minutes now to just write this in. All right, well, let's finish up on that one section. And now that you've been thinking about what are these kind of stories, these unthinking type of stories that just are said about that theme, let's now move to trying to figure out what is the core underlying metaphor, the core sort of foundational meaning making that leads to these stories. what is the metaphor of that theme, that ambiguous theme that we're looking at, that whatever it is you've chosen, when the dominant culture makes a foundational sense of it, what's the core metaphor they use about it? And don't worry if you're not quite sure. This is just, yeah, just something to think about. You don't, you're not going to get graded on coming up with the right answer or anything like that. But just think about, what do you see as the underlying metaphor of that theme? And now let's just move our attention to the outcomes. Given those kind of stories about the theme, and given that core metaphor underlying it, what are the outcomes that we see in the world today in relation to whatever theme you chose? All right. And now let's turn our attention to alternative ways of meaning making in relation to that theme. And on this side, let's begin with a core metaphor. So whatever theme you've chosen, ask yourself, what would be an alternative way, foundational, core, root way of making meaning of that theme? And now let's move to that middle section, the stories. If you made sense of your particular theme with that core metaphor, whatever you've come up with, what are the different kind of stories that might arise about that theme? What are the different kinds of ways in which people just might naturally make sense of that theme? Okay, and then let's finally go to outcomes. If our world as a whole started with that different metaphor of whatever theme it is and lived according to those different stories, what would be the outcomes we might expect in the future, in the world, relating to that theme? All right. Well, um, I'm as I'm looking at the time, I'm thinking that I really, really love to be hearing from as many of you as possible, like how you made sense of this, of both the whole presentation and the actual this cultural mindfulness mapping yourself. I'd love to hear experience like what you experienced from this. And one thing I'd point out, by the way, before we even move on from there is the idea behind this is not that you're going to figure out all these answers in just these few minutes you're spending on it, but just to sort of open your minds to this different way in which we can make sense of things. And then you can begin to use that in the world as a whole. When you're reading newspaper articles or just looking at what somebody's saying in some maybe something on the in a movie or whatever it might be, to realize, oh, they're looking at this from a particular core metaphor. It doesn't have to be looked at in this way. And just open that sort of almost like that mind muscle up to this potential that there's different ways we can make sense of things and how different the world would be if we did that. So it's more like this kind of opening to explore what's possible in the future. And just to let you know, like if you are interested in like, exploring these questions like much more deeply, these are the two books that I've written about this. That first one, The Parenting Instinct, looks historically. The Web of Meaning, as I said, looks at this different kind of worldview that could be a foundation for a much more life-affirming future for us. And by the way, if you're interested to find out more about my work, you can go to jeremylent.com. But also, there's a global community of thousands of people who are really looking at this kind of different ways of thinking that could lead to a different future. That we call ourselves the Deep Transformation Network, and it's an online community, and you can find it at deeptransformation.network. And so I totally invite you, if things are opening up to you and you like the idea of this, you can explore this with me and lots of other people on this online community. So I'm going to stop my sharing right now. And what I'd love to do, looking at the time, is I think we're going to skip any breakout rooms, because what I'd really love to do is to open this space up for anybody to either ask any questions that you have of me, from the presentation I gave or just about this workshop I took you through. But equally, I'd love to ask any of you to share what you just did on this work, on the workshop paper, like what theme you chose and any insights that came up to you when you did that. So let me pause and open things up to, just raise your Zoom hand if you want to share and ask or talk.
Pearl, go ahead.
Well, has her hand raised.
All right, thank you so much.
Hey,
It's just a little feedback that I have of this session. Firstly,
sure.
thank you so much, Jeremy, for such a brilliant session. Um, I loved the view of seeing Earth as a giving parent, firstly, and how you pieced together so concisely the point where humans and nature lived and worked together in harmony at the beginning, then to how we subsequently detached and separated ourselves from nature, leading to the global issues we see today. It's so important to mention how our views and values of today will shape our futures as we are creating history in the making. This was such a perfect session, personally, to end off day one of our understanding how do we need to know, live, and move together to create a world of our deepest longings. Most of us long for connection to ourselves, our purpose, others, and a more simpler way of life, like particularly root connection as represented by your first picture, being in harmony with nature and the living organisms around us, especially in today's fast-paced and tech-driven society we live in today. I think the other major point is our sense of seeing the world through our cultural upbringing and practice. We often practice what our parents taught us because it's what their parents taught them and so forth without questioning or taking into consideration if it serves us and our interbeing in today's world, or if these certain practices and beliefs got lost in translation during phenomena such as migration or language barriers. Secondly, we tend to believe immediately what our friends or family might say about a certain topic, whether it's education or a certain event that happened in the world, or even if it's like a country that they travel to. Like one person might have a bad experience, but another might have a good experience. But just because somebody that we know and is close to us had a bad experience, that automatically becomes the stereotype of that country. And majority of us don't tend to expand our knowledge by considering other views on certain topics, to then create our own informed opinion based on the effect that this particular view or belief has on the collective sustainability of the world. And then lastly, I love the connection of the indigenous communities by also stating that all of these communities basically share the same core way of life, and that seeing Earth as a giving parent. That's why I think we do call her Mother Earth, and we are her children, emphasizing the importance of interconnectedness and community. So thank you.
Mm. Well, Paul, thanks so much for God's getting summarizing so many like core, super important takeaways from all that. And yeah, and one thing I would just kind of emphasize that came from what you're saying to everyone is that thing like you don't have to take your parents' word for it in terms of this is how the world works, as well as the dominant culture. Like really, this is your life for you to determine for yourself what actually makes sense. And the more you question, there's deeper underlying structures of thought that are dominant culture and quite possibly your parents are sort of passing on to you, the more you can begin to connect up with the kind of transformation we need to move our entire global society away from the devastating path we're on. So yeah, I mean, this is our future. Our future depends so much on you and others who are young looking at these things and making sense of them in a different way. So yeah. And again, I'd love anybody who wants to share. It's kind of a little scary doing it in front of the whole group, whatever. But what theme you used and what sense you made of it when you did that. So I see Nupur, you have your hand up.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for this session. I have chosen a theme of inclusion, and in my country, India, what I have seen is the dominant stories around is that we have to uh, connect to only one minority community and include them into mainstream. Suppose if we take example of people with disabilities, they just go on, pick up some people, and then they just do some activity for them, and then just they say ki inclusion is done deal. But so the meaning and stories around it, like they are weak, we need to hold their hand, and we need to bring them in the society. But when I visualize my own meaning of it and the new worldview which I imagine, that inclusion is like really coming together and discovering things together, and it should happen like across disabilities as well, and uh, along with disability and mainstream society people as well. So for me, I believe um, then the stories would change to like people with disabilities are people first, and we should look at their other um, identities as well. Like they can be poets, they can be writers, they can be cooks, they can be doctors, engineers, anything. And then considering their disability, what kind of accommodations they need, and then people will start thinking according to really including them and making them part of the group other than doing some one day, 2 day activity. So
Mhm.
that's my theme, and I envisioned new worldview. Thank you.
Wow, it's fantastic. Wow, that's so beautiful to hear, Nupur, like, and liberating. And just what a sense that really by connecting with who we are as human beings, just the liberatory aspect of that is vast. That's so wonderful to hear how you interpreted that. Thank you. Thanks, Nupur. And Ela?
Yeah. Hi, Jeremy. It's lovely to
Hi.
meet you.
Yes.
Um, and I feel like the thing that really stuck out to me was this reminder of, and we love this phrase at Youth by Youth, but the new and ancient story of interbeing, that nature as parent mindset didn't, they tried very hard to stamp it out, but it's not gone anywhere. It still lives on not only in indigenous communities, but exactly as Pearl was alluding to, somewhere still in our dominant cultural worldview through Mother Earth and through these little hints that there is another way that's possible.
Mhm.
And I thought about liberation as my abstract concept because it's something that we talk about a lot. And I feel like is sometimes one of the words that can rub people up when I explain what I do. And I was so curious because just I think I was really left with this impression of how many people must feel like freedom is impossible and
Mhm.
terrifying and not worth it. And it was a really quite emotional exercise to do actually. And I think because we just gone through that reminder of also this particular dominant worldview of where we're going as a species, and this one possibility of what could happen in the next 20 years.
Mm.
It felt like, yeah, it felt very emotional to think about liberation as being dangerous and unattainable or escapism or a false path. Um, and then thinking about actually what kind of a world we could create if our root metaphor was that actually liberation is just our natural state.
Mm.
Like it just is us as beings, which I feel like is what most spiritual paths teach, that ultimately form is emptiness, emptiness is form. We are liberated, and then all this muck gets on
Yeah.
top. And yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I got the mindfulness that really came through.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, thanks, Ela. And yeah, I think that something it's such a profound theme to choose, like liberation. And I was thinking to the extent to which the patriarchy, which ultimately is this underlying sort of cultural, almost like tonality of had so many cultures raise us, and it's all about um, telling. It's sort of almost like putting barriers around people, right from when we're early, just young infants, saying this is how you should think about this. This is what you should do, and you're not allowed to break out of that. And so as we get older and we begin to mature and become adults, we sort of live almost like in a self-created prison of the mind, which is partly self-created, but it's been created from outside. But then as just to learn how to get along, we begin to accommodate to that. So we create our own structures of mind. And that's basically how the patriarchy continues generation after generation. It's a thing that's known as cultural hegemony, where it uses internal oppression, basically, to maintain those rigid barriers, which then we pass on to the next generation, the next generation. So that active liberation it takes a lot of courage often, because if we've grown up in that way, then it's like, what's out there? We don't know. And it's how do we even know how to relate to it or anything? So it takes a ton of courage to begin to open towards those possibilities. But when we do, like you say, it's a whole different experience because we suddenly realize, wow, life can be so much more. So yeah, thanks for that. Love that. Um, and yeah, so we have 5 minutes. There's still time for just a couple more people if they want to share their theme or just ask any question or anything. And by the way, I recommend if you have any ways of staying connected as a group, to share with each other what your themes are. It's actually really fascinating to look at what other people chose. oftentimes when I do workshops on this, we'll do it over a longer period, and then we'll have a platform, and people will share what they did in that platform. And I love looking at it, always learning new perspectives like that. So who wants to take the leap and share what they did? I see, Mohini, you chose to be bold. Thank you. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Yeah, I think I'm in the state of still processing a lot of what you shared, and has recently read your latest book, and I followed your book kind of guide alongside it, and I was reflecting on how I had answered those questions. I chose freedom, and I think deeply resonate with what Elish said, and also with what Pearl shared about this idea of yeah, I think the idea that we've all felt freedom. We came into this world, I think, with that. And to me, for me, it feels comforting. It feels comforting that we are relearning ways of being. We are relearning ways of being that are so instinctual to us. So instinctual to us um as as beings on this planet. Yeah, I found that I kept going to this idea of knowledge, and the idea of decolonizing knowledge, but also unlearning knowledge, and how that kind of goes into our ways of being and really fuels us, that cultural significance. And how I'm kind of all over the place, but how through that that metaphor, through the shift in that metaphor, the kind of freedom we get is so it's it was interesting to imagine that freedom. I don't think I've actively sat down and imagined that freedom, imagined it in a way of autonomy, of um of the freedom of knowing, the freedom of merely existing, the freedom of everything. I think that was quite an overwhelming thought to think of. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Mahini, and I really get this theme that I'm picking up from what pretty much everyone said about how that's that sense of freedom, and it connects with basically who we are as human beings, our core evolutionary niche. And I just put in the chat, just if anyone wants to explore this further, there's this writer. Her name is Dasha Narvaez. She's basically an evolutionary biologist, but also she writes a lot about indigenous cultures, and she writes about what she calls the human evolutionary niche, which is that as nomadic hunter-gatherers, and that's how we evolved as human beings, we learned right from infancy different ways of being alive, and that involved freedom. There was not this kind of patriarchy of having to obey rules and being told we're meant to be certain ways. That if you, even now today, the few indigenous groups around the world that haven't been sort of totally transformed by the modern world, kids just get to run free. And there's no one telling them what they went to do. There's no teacher trying to teach them. They teach themselves, or adults teach them, but not in a formal way, but just because they want to know something, and they ask the adult, how did you do this? And so there's this incredible freedom that is part of our human heritage that has been lost through thousands of years of patriarchy. And so, if anyone wants to explore that more, definitely recommend it. Yes, and thank you, Ila, for saying she wrote a great book with Wahinke Topan. That's his indigenous, where his name is Four Arrows in English, about connecting with that indigenous knowledge and how we can use that in the modern world today. So great stuff. Well, looks like we've at the hour. So and so much more to talk about, but hopefully this has really opened up pathways for each of you in terms of further exploration.
And thank you so much. I hope you extend all of us a huge thank you to Jeremy for your wisdom, and what a beautiful note to end on, because we're actually tomorrow starting our day with embodying and exploring how do we live into the world of our deepest longing. So we're moving into this realm of how we know to actually how we start being that knowledge, and walking it with all of our actions. So it feels like this is actually, we've completed the arc of the day in an absolutely marvelous way. And we really, really, really thank you for all of that, Jeremy. And if that would be okay, we'd love to also share that presentation with the people who had to miss this session, because we're all in different timelines, or time zones, timelines as well, probably. Like, so yeah, wanting to make sure that everyone gets that knowledge, because it was actually so foundational to understanding where we are and where we're going.
Great. Well, absolutely. More than okay with that. And again, just to repeat that invitation to, you can, feel free to just join us there on the Deep Transformation Network, as we all collectively do these explorations together. So look forward to that. Okay. Take care then, and enjoy the rest of this festival. So it seems amazing.
Thank you.